The Molinist idea is that God has what's called middle knowledge, and it's called middle knowledge because it comes in between God's so-called natural knowledge, knowledge of all possibilities, and God's free knowledge, knowledge of everything that's actual. And the main, and I think the most controversial objects of middle knowledge are what are called counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. And these are conditional propositions that state with respect to any creature God might create what they would do in any situation in which they were created and left free. And the idea here then is that God doesn't have any control over the counterfactuals of freedom, their truth values. So in other words, which worlds that are possible, that are open to God, isn't up to God. But among the worlds open to him, God has complete control over which one will then be actual, if any. And so the attraction of Molinism is that it offers, at least allegedly, the strongest account of divine providence short of theological determinism, consistent with libertarian freedom. So if you think, as many theists do, that libertarian freedom is important to maintain for creatures, and you want a strong account of providence, it's hard to see what other game. I mean, Hasker, I think Bill Hasker said, Molinism is the only game in town if you want something in between sort of the risk-taking God of open theism and maybe what's called Calvinism or Augustinianism or Thomism, depending on the label, a very much stronger account which doesn't seem to be compatible with libertarian freedom. Well, I think Molinists and their rivals seem to have reached a bit of a dead end or an impasse, rather, whether Molinism is actually coherent. So, there's big questions about whether there are these truths to be known. This is part of what's called the so-called grounding objection, of which there are many versions. How could there be any truths about, at the moment when God has middle knowledge, there aren't any creatures. So what could make these things true? How could they be true? At best, you might be probabilities likely to do various things, but even then, if at the time there are no creatures at all, that these are supposed to be useful in providential deliberation, there aren't any creatures, what could make these things true? Molinists think they've answered it. Their critics think they're hallucinating. It's hard to see where we're going. I think the future probably lies in looking at the applications of Molinism and vis-a-vis its competitors. So Molinism is thought to be advantageous to answer a range of issues involving divine providence, whether it's petitionary prayer, prophecy, foreknowledge and free will, incarnation, perseverance of saints, biblical inspiration, original sin, and so on. Now, whether Molinism really has the advantages is maybe up for grabs. But in part, you may think that, what do the rivals have to say? Can they do any better? So I think the real work is going to be in the applications. And of course, open theists have been working on their own applications, their own accounts of providence and the problems they think they can handle. And so I think that's where the real work is going to be in the future. And one of the issues, evil, of course, that was the problem of evil. Alvin Plantinga sort of reinvented the doctrine in the early 1970s. The Molinist doctrine, what's called Molinist, the key notion of middle knowledge. And so there's still issues to do with that, whether it makes the problem of evil harder or any easier. And it's hard to see exactly where that's going. So, there's a lot of objections to the account, but if I could plug a piece of, you mentioned a book that I did recently for the Oxford on Molinism. There's also, I did a short piece in Philosophy Compass, which is perhaps more accessible as an introduction to the main objections and all the standard replies that Molinists have given. This was called Recent Work on Molinism, and that was in 2013.